the back, you've heard this word before. Down at the bottom, scary or not, and it goes away. To look at this one more time, word is heard, compared up in the front part of the brain to other times, lower part of the brain to their emotional reactions to the word is confirmed, etc. All of that happens every single time, every word. Now, as far as we know, Emily Dickinson never saw a magnetoencephalogram. We think it's unlikely. But had she seen a magnetoencephalogram, she might have said what? The brain is wider than the sky. The brain is deeper than the sea. What we learn from all of this about learning is this, that mind is not an abstraction. Mind's not just some filmy, foggy, cloudy, uncertain thing that floats above your head. Turns out mind is based in brain, which is this working physical organ which is part of a living human being. So the whole idea that you could separate body from mind doesn't make any sense. But we do that all the time. We do it in higher education. How do we do it in higher education? Academic affairs, student affairs. Brain, body. How do we do it in the rest of the world? School for your mind, after-school activities for the rest of you, etc. So we tend to think in this way that these are separate. And this comes all the way back to Descartes, the philosopher. If you remember anything about Descartes, he said famously in Latin, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. Meaning the part of me that thinks is who I am, and then there's all this other mess. Body, emotion, spirit, mess. Maybe we'll put that in the residence hall. And this other part that thinks and is pure we'll take to the class. There's nothing in the neuroscience that lets us think that's right. Everything in the neuroscience, in fact, says that Descartes was wrong. Which, because you are a college audience, unfortunately, Mr. President, allows me to tell you my only philosopher joke, which is about Descartes. Descartes, remember, said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So Descartes is sitting in a cafe in Paris. He's having a cup of coffee. The server walks up to him and says, Monsieur Descartes, would you like some more coffee? He says, I think not, and disappeared. Separate, that's the only one of those you'll have to. So separating mind and body doesn't work, Descartes notwithstanding. And what we learn is learning is brain-based. And this has a very important implication. And that is, since learning happens in the brain of a real live person, it's not happening in the mind of an abstraction. It's happening in the brain of a real live person. Then that person, the learner, matters in the learning. So you can't think about learning without thinking about the learner, because the state of mind or state of brain of the learner might matter. Would you like to see some proof that that's true? Here you are. This is another landmark study. This comes from the Brookhaven National Laboratory out on Long Island, SUNY Stony Brook, and from NYU's positron emission tomography learning project. What they did here was take 3 people who had very different states of mind or brain and had them learn the same thing at the same time, and then did these positron emission tomograms to see what their brains looked like while they were learning. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to figure this out. 3 different brains. Here is a person said to be normal. We're not sure we've met that person. There's this person. Here's a person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Here's a person with a diagnosis of depression. And if you look at them, all you have to notice is they're not the same. 3 people trying to learn exactly the same thing at the same time. But what they bring to the learning process is not the same, so the learning doesn't look the same. So the depressed person and the normal person compared, for example, the depressed person has a lot less of that high color activity. It looks, you might say, flat, which is what we think people with depression feel like, flat. And if this weren't clear enough, we have another example. Here you're looking at two sets of functional magnetic resonance imaging scans on two college students. You might, on the left is one student, on the right is the other. These are pictures taken from the top of the head. So the upper part of each picture is the front of the head, the lower part is the back. And as you look at this, these two people are trying to learn the same thing too. But compare for a minute that to that. Compare this to that. Compare these to those. Compare these to those. Trying to learn the same thing at the same time. What's the difference between these people? This one is not depressed, this one is. And it's the discovery of the effect of problems like depression on learning, which has completely changed the way we think about how people learn in college. This is what has generated 3 major projects in the past 5 years designed to try to recognize and treat depression among college students, not just to relieve their suffering, which is extremely important, but to help them learn better, because they came here to learn, and depression impairs learning. So screening for depression becomes not only a life-saving act sometimes, but a brain-saving, mind-saving, semester-saving, academic life-saving, GPA-saving, graduation-saving act. So screening for depression becomes important because the learner matters in the learning. Now you might say, that's all kind of interesting, but what happened between Emily Dickinson sitting in a blank room in Amherst writing about the brain and having these strange ideas about the sea and all these neurophysiologic studies? Well, it turns out a lot of other things happened intervening. There are lots of ways of knowing about learning, and here's a list of just some of those. We have been studying learning for almost 2 millennia in philosophy and the discipline of epistemology. And then there are the experimental, clinical, and research disciplines of psychology. There are the research and scholarship processes on adult learning, which used to be thought to be different from undergraduate learning, not so. There is the pedagogical research done by Centers for the Study of Teaching and Learning. There is the documented real-world experience of how people learn in corporate training programs, military training, etc. And then more recently, there are the basic and clinical neurosciences, and then a whole group of brand new schools of thought with names that you might not even recognize. Neurophilosophy, neuroconstructivism. There are now tenured professors of neurophilosophy in American universities, degree programs in neuroconstructivism, as we begin to devote tremendous amounts of interdisciplinary resources to understanding learning more effectively. If you took all of those things together, up to the time of the neurosciences, and tried to figure out what did we learn from epistemology, psychology, learning theory, etc. What did we learn from those? We learned 3 big things. First, we learned that learning itself is a very complicated, very dynamic interaction that happens between students and other people, some of them professors, some of them other students, some of them staff members. It also happens between students and experiences, objects, events, things they do. And that set of complex interactions results in each learner constructing meaning, making knowledge for themselves. We all go look, remember at the harbor, and come away with our own view of what the harbor means or what it's about. And finally, we learned that learning integrates 2 things that we used to think were pretty separate. One is the learning and development of a person, and the other is the application, acquisition of knowledge. So it used to be thought back in the days of Descartes, which was until like 2 months ago, it used to be thought that there was student development, which was the body, spirit, emotions, and there was learning, which was the mind. But it turns out, no, they're all learning. Just different ways in which learning occurs and places in which it occurs. And this is all nicely summarized in this country by the National Research Council, which in 2002 released a big summary report called How People Learn, that said what you see here. They said, shift is from the view that learning is the acquisition of desired knowledge to the idea that it is the construction of knowledge. That each learner constructs knowledge for themselves. They do that in the context of their own history, the social environment, what they knew before. In other words, the learner matters in the learning.